Everyone has an intuitive understanding of intelligence, what it means to be or act smart. And everyone knows how harshly, sometimes irreversibly, bad decisions can change a human life. But unbeknownst to many people, the scientific research on understanding intelligence is continuously progressing far beyond the pop IQ tests you can find on the internet. So what is intelligence, and to what degree does it really determine the outcome of our lives? Can it be improved, and how does it affect the structure of society? Especially in our modern world that relies ever more on technology, high intelligence becomes a requirement for most occupations, and understanding it becomes vital, politically, culturally, individually. So we attended one of the most renowned conferences on intelligence research worldwide to get a glimpse behind the science and talk directly to some of the people searching for the answers we need.
All right. Tell me when?
Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Jordan Lasker. We are at the International Society for Intelligence Research's 2022 conference in Vienna. We're at the University of Vienna. It's right up there. And people have been giving great talks all day.
Very cool to be here, actually. It's one of the most diverse conferences, I think, which is out there in the whole space of the social sciences, because the topic of intelligence, it just attracts so many different minds coming from so many different disciplines.
Yeah, my name's Johnny Anomaly. I'm a professor in the United States, although I'm living in Ecuador for the year.
So, hi, I'm Tobias Wolfram. I'm a behavioral geneticist / sociologist.
Yeah, my name is Paulina. I'm a first-year psychology student at Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main.
Hi, my name is Camille Williams, and I'm a third-year PhD student at Sorbonne Université and École Normale Supérieure.
Yes, I am Helmut Nyborg. I'm professor of developmental and child psychology.
My name is Alena Smirnova. I'm a professor for analysis and modeling of complex data at the University of Mainz.
So I'm Greg Clark. I'm actually a professor of economics, but I have a strong interest in social mobility and the determinants of social outcomes.
What is interesting about intelligence research?
I think it's one of the most underexplored areas in academia, especially in psychology. Interestingly, psychology is going through what they call a replication problem, which is that most branches of psychology, the studies that are published, can't be replicated. They turn out to be often in favor of politically correct conclusions, but when you try to replicate them independently, they don't. One of the few areas of psychology that is well replicated is intelligence research. So it's interesting because it's both controversial, and yet it's probably the most scientific branch of psychology.
Intelligence has so many implications for the whole of your life. It's not just a score you get from writing a test, but it has implications overall for your friendships, romantic partnerships, hobbies, interests, education, later on which workplace, which occupation you choose. So it's a really broad topic, and that's what sparked my interest, basically.
Intelligence is a very broad construct, so how people differ in their cognitive abilities, there's so many areas that might be interested in that. Biological research, genetics research, explaining what underlies intelligence, but also educational research or political reforms even that think about what is implied by our basic research findings. And I actually think that to make progress in the field, we need to get people to work together from those different perspectives, because let's say a cognitive psychologist, which I am, doesn't have the capacity to do all sorts of neuroscientific genetic modeling and also the statistical modeling. So it's, I think, very important to bring those expertises together.
The research combines many fields and perspectives, but one concept seems to come up consistently throughout all approaches: general intelligence, the sum of all cognitive abilities of a person, called the G factor, or simply G. So, what is G?
G, general intelligence. That's the big question. What is it? Everybody wants to know. Everybody wants to figure that one out. That's the primary goal of intelligence research. Intelligence in this field is defined as that thing which explains the positive manifold, which is the positive, universally positive correlations between all areas of cognitive performance. We don't know why it emerges. We do know that it is a substantial factor. It's a factor that just keeps coming up regardless of how you look for it, regardless of how much you want to disprove it. It keeps showing up. And it has a lot of validity in the real world. It predicts lots of things. It predicts what you think it would, and it doesn't predict what you don't think it would, if you know the research. It can be measured from anything, so it's not really certain what it is. It has nothing to do with specific content. I have done research measuring it with sensory discrimination tasks, which is to say how well you can differentiate colors or sounds, and even how well you can sense different touch sensations, tell which of the two similarly weighted weights weighs more, etc. All those things measure intelligence, so saying exactly what it is a very difficult matter. In a sense, we could say that intelligence is just the functioning of it's how well the brain functions to do what humans are marketed for, the thing that makes us Homo sapiens. Everything measures intelligence as long as it has some aspect of cognitive performance. As long as you can do objectively better or worse, then it'll measure intelligence. That's the gist of this thing called the indifference of the indicator. The idea that everything, regardless of its content, it could be a Piagetian test where they tell you which one of these has more water in its two differently shaped glasses. It could be a vocabulary test. It could be a mathematics test. They could ask you to multiply fractions together. That's going to be an intelligence test to some degree or another.
People have been saying that there are different kinds of intelligence.
They're not really right. It's a curious little topic. The idea is popularized by people like Gardner, who say, we have these like visuospatial intelligence, or we have the ability to dance, or we have kinesiological intelligence, or whatever it may be. And what we generally find is that when you measure each of these things, or you attempt to measure them, you find much more support for the things they have in common. What they share is much bigger than the stuff that they have independently.
If general intelligence truly is a universal measure of cognitive ability, there is no need to mention why people should care about this research, but let's ask anyway.
Oh boy, intelligence research is very important. It has implications for everyday life, and it has implications for the way we go forward with our lives altogether. If we have a less intelligent society, we have a lot of burden to deal with, and if we have a more intelligent society, then we have much easier lives all around. Making people more intelligent, making them able to better harness their intelligence, giving people better educations and whatnot is very important because it allows us to build a better world. So this conference is about the study of the thing behind building that better world.
There are individual differences in intelligence and probably group differences in intelligence. And to the extent that intelligence is highly heritable, we want to figure out, which environmental interventions will help boost everyone up, because we should all care that everyone is the best they can be.
Because it's very important to consider both the environmental and the genetic influences that affect educational attainment, intelligence, as well as all these other complex traits.
The use cases of intelligence research, they are so broad, and they have been for such a long time, since intelligence research started to exist in the early 19th century, because we nowadays know so much about how intelligence actually is structured, what we can change about it, whether it can be influenced via certain social interventions, and mostly unfortunately can't, but all these things are of course relevant for policymakers, for how we structure our education, these issues concerning mental health, also what we do with at-risk populations, people who are gifted with very high intelligence, whether they might suffer from certain debilitating psychological problems and whether we can help them in some way.
Intelligence is the single most interesting variable. If you know how much education a child will get, what salary you will get, how big a house you will get, and everything else equal, it is dominating in the predictive power of how people's life will unfold.
There seems to be an underlying dispute whether it is possible to intervene in societal structures or whether we are bound to our fate by intelligence as an unchangeable attribute of our being. Can society be equal with such differences in intelligence, especially if these are primarily genetic?
You know, to the extent that intelligence is genetic and we don't necessarily deserve our genes in some deep sense, a lot of people, well, a few people at the high end of the intelligence spectrum are going to get huge wages if we just leave the economy as it is. And it's not clear that's the fairest society. And so what we probably don't want is a society where a few of the smartest people get all of the income and everyone else is left behind. And so when we think about automation and the evolution of technology, we're going to want to think about how do we use this for the good of all, but still reward intelligent people who are very productive, because they do help all of us. But we don't want a society that's so unequal that the rest of us are struggling just because of our genetics.
This is where, in some sense, you get into a quandary. A lot of people prize the idea of high rates of social mobility, that I can't tell at birth that you're going to be in the bottom 10%, you're going to be in the top 10%. And so, you know, in that sense, you would say, no, this actually created a much more class-based society and a much more rigid society where people's life chances are much more strongly determined, right? On the other hand, if you think, well, look, we get enormous benefits from scientific discoveries, from the advances that are coming from a very small percentage of people who are now running Silicon Valley or BMW or various other places, then you would say, hey, we've created the ideal society because we're creating a cadre of people at the top who have these very high intellectual abilities. And so there is this interesting tension between our hopes for social mobility and, on the contrary, our hopes for technological and scientific advance.
Equity is a fantasy. The idea of not just equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome. That is an absolute fantasy if you take intelligence differences seriously. Because once we equalize the environment, we're still going to have these genetic differences. And so what we're going to have to do is learn to live with the fact of biological inequality while still having policies that treat people fairly. And so I think that was that's right on the money. That's what we need to think about.
A perfect society will always remain a fantasy. However, after talking to many different researchers, one essential social issue crystallizes: education. Can it be improved through intelligence research, and if yes, how? Do you think there are educational conclusions to be drawn from intelligence research?
Absolutely. The first actual paper on the subject of general intelligence was based on people's grades, based on their educational attainments measured directly at the school. It was Spearman's 1904 article about intelligence objectively measured and defined. And since then, the conclusions have changed very little. We've come up consistently saying, yes, intelligence matters for kids, and the more and the better we understand it, the better we can intervene to help kids out if they're struggling, to identify those who need to be accelerated and whatnot. And we can, through this research, understand that we can waste less of people's lives and give them better and fuller lives through comprehending how they are, comprehending how bright they are, comprehending how much we need to help them and how much we might not.
Of course, your evolution and your development depends on many things. But if you have to choose just one factor as the selective factor, that will be intelligence. But then comes the personality factors in. And it doesn't matter if you have a sky-high intelligence if your personality is working against unfolding it. So if you are a lazy person, you might have a very high intelligence, but it will not unfold.
Yeah, I was just interested in the subject. I have written a bit about cognitive enhancement and what benefits there might be of a cognitively enhanced population. So that's like a personal interest because I publish in that area, specifically genetic selection for cognitive enhancement. But I think even if we couldn't do that, it would still be interesting because we want to know what explains individual differences in achievement. And we want to know, I mean, it's a genuine question that I think we all care about. What's the efficacy of different systems of education? What about parenting? All of them matter, but the question is how much. And I think the general public often overestimates how important they are. And so I think it's important to just get to the bottom of that.
Should educators care more about this research?
Definitely. And in fact, this is something that behavioral geneticists who study the genetic differences between individuals. This is something they've been emphasizing both on the left and on the right. So for example, at the University of Texas, Paige Harden, who's very much a leftist, is quite concerned that people on her side don't understand that large amounts of measurable intelligence are inherited by the parents and not produced in schools. And she thinks, look, what this suggests is we could have redistribution of some kinds, but it's different than what traditional leftists would think. And on the right, a lot of people are going to say, look, part of the problem with some of these redistributionist schemes is they're not going to work, right? So we're going to constantly spin our wheels and blame ourselves for problems that actually aren't easily solved through educational institutions.
I am Andreas Dimitriou. I come from Cyprus. I was the Minister of Education of Cyprus for 4 years. That's about 10 years ago.
Did your intelligence research back then change your political decisions as a minister?
It did. It did a lot, actually, mainly because I have a connection with the international community. So when I was the minister, we set up several committees involving about 600 people, which make proposals to the ministry to change the curriculum. What of this remained after 10 years I left the ministry? Quite a lot, actually. Everything that was not politically debatable, for example, teaching mathematics, physics, reading and so on, is still implemented.
So intelligence research undeniably affects our society, from politics to education to even interpersonal relationships. But it also seems to imply some unpopular concepts. Is this the reason intelligence research is often considered controversial?
People are sometimes intimidated when talking about intelligence because many people link the intelligence quotient of a person to that person's value. People have this misperception, and I think that's mainly the problem that makes the topic actually, I don't like to call it controversial, but that is, I think, why it is, or is perceived controversial.
Well, there's always something you don't enjoy, but I think that's for the scientific discussion and not for our interview here.
Oh, I think conferences like these are very important because there is at least modern social science, there is a terrible orthodoxy that descends, and having conferences where people are able to express views that are outside that orthodoxy is just very important for the continuation of progress, right? Because you really don't want to set up a world where you would say to someone, that would be a fine study, but no one's going to like the results, so don't do it, right? And so I think it is important for people to have outlets where unfashionable views can actually find some purchase. What we are burdened with in any area of social investigation is that people's hopes and beliefs have just intruded far too much in terms of the types of explanations they're willing to accept and the type of evidence they would demand, right? And so it's just very hard. When you're doing physics, no one cares about the proton and the character of the proton and whether the proton is happy or not, right? Yeah. But when you're doing social science, I mean, and I've noticed this in submitting papers, that it's still very heavily kind of ideologically laden, this area. And unfortunately, there's no way to escape this. And there's actually tremendous pressure. And so in collecting data for this study, we submitted a grant application and to the National Science Foundation. And it went to the sociology panel. And one reviewer said, this study seeks to explain why social mobility is slow. We should only fund studies that seek to increase the rate of social mobility, right? and that we should never fund something, right? We don't. What's the interest in learning something like this? All of our funding should be about how we actually change and improve rates of social mobility. And so, as I say, it's a perpetual burden in this area.
Yeah, I just hope that people will have an open mind about this stuff because it's one of the most important sciences, and we should learn to separate science from morality. The two are connected, but just coming up with a scientific result doesn't say communism or capitalism or something like this. We need to sort of trade off different values and sort of have first an accurate science that informs our public policies, rather than saying, I don't like this scientific conclusion, so I'm going to make it illegal to do this, or I'm going to cancel people for doing this research. It's extremely important research.
How can we find working solutions to real-life social problems if we don't evaluate their reality correctly? And how can we understand that reality if we simply ignore unwanted discoveries? Even the best intentions might lead us to wrong conclusions with possibly catastrophic outcomes. But the science of intelligence research is not settled, even though its findings are very strong in evidence. We should remember that our future will heavily depend on the understanding of intelligence, so it is in all of our interests to follow the debate and support unbiased research to gain a better understanding of the human mind.